Good morning. You can feel it in yourself, how after the physical movement stops, it takes a few seconds for the inner movement to catch up. Maybe more than a few seconds, but anyway, it's so sweet. You can feel it. You can hear it with the inner ear. So another poem by Marie Howe, The Star Market. The people Jesus loved were shopping at the Star Market yesterday. It's almost enough, isn't it? Just that line. I mean, the people Jesus loved were shopping at the Star Market yesterday. An old lead-colored man standing next to me at the checkout breathed so heavily I had to step back a few steps. Even after his bags were packed, he stood still, breathing hard and hawking into his hand. The feeble, the lame, I could hardly look at them. Shuffling through the aisles, they smelled of decay, as if the Star Market had declared a day off for the able-bodied. And I had wandered in with the rest of them, sour milk, bad meat, looking for cereal and spring water. Jesus must have been a saint, I said to myself, looking for my lost car in the parking lot later, stumbling among the people who would have been lowered into rooms by ropes, who would have crept out of caves or crawled from the corners of public baths on their hands and knees, begging for mercy. If I touch only the hem of his garment, one woman thought, I will be healed. Could I bear the look on his face when he wheels around? We'll sit for a while, eyes open or closed as pleases you. Let yourself rest. Sunday is supposed to be a day of rest. Today's Sunday. But what if every day was a day of rest? Even when you're outwardly busy. Imagine that. It's not about too much to do. It's not about that before, and it's not going to be about that after. Before, you think it's about too much to do, not enough downtime, too much distraction, too many things that trigger you. And after, you discover that wasn't the case. As long as you think life is in the way, it will be. Do you know what I mean? Last night, people brought up a few things that you said you'd like us to look at today, and so we'll do some of that now, and then later on, I'll see if anybody came up with anything else overnight. The thing about when you have a pressing life decision to make, how do you do it without thinking? This is really rich terrain. I love this. Because we'll keep having to figure things out, won't we? And, stuff will keep changing, and we'll keep needing to make adjustments and choices, and so the capacity in you that's able to tell that you're here and that's able to notice that you're thinking is a very powerful, capable capacity. We're used to imagining that when something's got to be decided, a course of action, or, we have to think about it. That's just the default. And the kind of thinking we typically do about something that is a big deal, will have ramifications for our lives and maybe the lives of others. Typically that kind of thinking has a lot of emotion mixed in with it. It's caused by the thinking. And it's circular, it tends to be circular, it tends to be fear with it. That's one thing. This other thing that we all have available to us is what I think of as attention. And it's looking. looking at the situation in front of you, the factors that are in the picture that you can see, and there's a lot you can't see. And that's really key to allow that. And when we're thinking in an emotional kind of way, we don't want to know that there's stuff we don't know. We don't want to know that we can't absolutely predict that we'll make the right decision, that things will go the way we want them to go. But when you're looking, you're just looking, not processing. It's a passive, it's like you can sit as if for meditation and allow to come to you the things, the known things that are in the picture, the current situation, the possible change, whatever the factors are, just quietly, in a receptive way, allow them to come to you and look. It's a very still thing. There isn't movement, there isn't the wheel turning thing. It's absolutely empty of emotion, in fact. Because your mind is quiet. The only reason emotion happens is when the mind is going in this egoic, circular way. And it's really key when you do this to allow into the picture the truth that there's only so much you know and you're not in control. When we're thinking in an emotion-laden way, we know those things are there, but we don't welcome them. We don't allow them to, as it were, take up space. You look and you see what there is to see. And something may come to you by way of direction or course of action, or you may see in that stillness that's rinsed of thought and emotion, there may be a recognition of something you would not have been able to see if you'd thought about it, because you would have been afraid. So it might be something difficult or something creative that will just come to you. Oh, that hadn't dawned on you. Part of what's going on in that spaciousness is there's a fluidity of awareness that means because none of this is loaded and because you're in utter recognition of not being in control and not knowing everything, you're able to move and the angle can change. You're able to see more deeply into things than you would have been before. Something may come to you, an insight, a direction, and it may not. What you may see in that particular episode of doing this looking, what you may see is that there's nothing yet to be known. There's nothing yet to be decided. And so then you just let it go and you revisit it another time. Or one of those times, something may come to you and you see, this is given what I'm able to see now, which is limited, and it will always be limited, this is what looks like the best course of action to me. And you know, as you have that recognition, that you don't know how it's going to go. You do the best you can with what you see at the time, knowing that that's no predictor of anything. It's all you can do is the best you can do with what you can see at the time. And then you proceed, and if you stay conscious through or even if you go in and out of conscious, you could say, I can't think of the word, the acting out of the thing that you've decided to do, then you'll notice if you're feeling attached to the outcome. You'll notice if there's anxiety or there's a mental thing, oh, this isn't what I thought would happen. You'll be able to adjust. You'll go back and do that thing again, and you stay soft and fluid, and everything will always change. I mean, even if the thing I saw on one of those times of sitting with it, even if the direction I thought I would like to go in, you could say, bears fruit, comes into being, other things meanwhile will come in. This is what life will be like until the moment you die. Okay, other things will keep coming in. So a change may be in order, and then you won't be rigid about it. We want so much to, especially with a big decision or a big change, we want so much to know ahead of time that it's going to deliver the goods. This is going to take care of things. This is going to make us all happy or stable. We don't know that. We will never know it. And when you finally let yourself know that you don't know that and you never will, then it's a little more possible to be comfortable in perennial uncertainty and not being in control. All you can ever do is the best you can do given what you can see at the time. You know that thinking has started up if you start to feel uncomfortable. That's how you can tell the difference between thinking, I'm talking about egoic thinking, and attention. Attention is still, it's neutral, it's not loaded, it's seeing just the way you see a piece of the floor. If you start thinking, well, what if this, what if that? If the movies start playing in your head, you're going to feel that generates emotion, fear often, denial of what you're not in control of. If you see that happening, ask yourself what's doing the thinking. See that you're thinking, first of all. And just back up in your awareness. Back up behind the thinker so that you're looking at the thinker. And get still. You can do this. You really can do this. And it's very humbling. Because when you look in this utterly still way, that's absent emotion, you're brought into the presence of how much you don't know and how much you're not in control of. And somehow you proceed anyway. And the subject of, I want to say a little bit more about thought. The mind doesn't function only in service to the ego. Most of the time it does. The reason that happens is that we are allegedly the most highly evolved species on the planet. And I only sort of jokingly say allegedly, because even though we've made a mess of an awful lot, we're the only ones that have built cathedrals and written books and so on. There's something to be said for that. Our minds, because they're really good, our brains are really good, have served us in the game of survival. What the ego has done is, because we feel like we are our egos, that's how we experience ourselves, And so any damage, any threat to the ego is an existential threat, so the ego thinks. So the ego has taken the mind to its own purposes. And so when the mind says, when the egoic mind says, emergency, you've just made a fool of yourself, or so-and-so doesn't love you anymore, you're not going to be able to carry on. The ego is trying to use the mind, that excellent mind that's able to use language and imagine that time is a real thing and visualize possible danger, all of that, which serves us on the animal level, knowing enough to run away from a bear. But on the egoic level, it just causes trouble. You can watch that happening. It feels like, oh my God, I'm going to die here if I don't get this job. It feels like death. Or, oh my God, I'm going to die if I fall off the cliff into the so-called void. But sometimes we think in a way that's not tied up in the ego, that has to do with being a really highly evolved, intelligent animal that's able to, for instance, figure out how to reset a bone that's broken and teach somebody else how to do that. And invent an airplane that can take you to other parts of the planet. I mean, when you're creative, when you're learning, when you're teaching, when you're exploring, don't you feel absolutely alive then? And there's no emotional angst then, unless you're attached to what you're doing, and then the ego has come in and is using the mind. But so one of the pleasures of discovering your several capacities is to pay it. You've had this experience many times already. The use of your mind, the application of it, gives you the sensation of vitality. It's not causing angst. So notice that when it's happening and see what is the difference between what's going on there and what's going on when the ego has gotten hold of the mind and said, let's invent an emergency here. Let's be afraid. Somebody asked a bunch of eminent scientists, one of whom was Einstein, what mode were you in when your great insights came to you, discoveries? And I know Einstein said, and I think most or maybe all of the other ones said, I wasn't thinking. There's the great thinkers. Obviously, they thought a lot, and it's been of great benefit to the rest of us. But, so the subject of paths came up last night. Paths to awakening.
Can I just ask you a question about what you just said?
Well, will you remember it? Is it okay if you wait a bit? Thanks. When you visualize a path, you've entered into time. When you visualize a journey, those kinds of things can't compute if only this moment is real. So you're much better off to... So a path is towards something that isn't already here. And that's the first problem, that we think that. So somebody later, possibly you, can look back in the mind's picture of what happened, apparently over time. You may see what looks like how you got there. You may be wrong. People often think they know what got them there, and we don't really have any idea. Let alone do we have any idea ahead of time. So, if there's a path, it's unique to each person. There may be supports along the way, things, environments, books, practices, life's agonies, that's the best one, that shock you into wakefulness in a given moment, in which moment you see something in yourself that you might never have seen before. So if you're aware, if there's something you're moved toward, one of those things, a spiritual community, which also came up last night, that in which you become, you sense yourself being more real with yourself, then of course you'll move in that direction. If something causes the gong of inner recognition of truth to go off in you, you'll naturally gravitate to that until it's not necessary anymore. But if you take comfort, or if you wish you could find the right path or something like that, rather than trying to answer that, see what the idea of a path or a journey creates in your mind. Remember that the only problem ever is that we can't see what we're looking out with. It isn't there, it's not later. And that's uncomfortable, making yourself remember that and come back again and again. This is it, right now. This ordinary, the trip in the grocery store that Marie Howe wrote about. This is it. And there are a million ways up the mountain, as people say. It's the same mountain. And you don't really know what your way was even after you are there. You sure as heck don't know ahead of time. Paul, you mentioned the thing last night about having this sense when that space is occurring, that we're all there together. Right? Am I saying this right? When anytime things get still enough in here that the mind is quiet and the self, the familiar self isn't apparent, one of the things that's possible to sense is that everything's the same. The oneness. What happens when, or we were looking into each other's eyes, what happens when your sense of separateness, the artificial thing that is dissolved momentarily or for good? And you're not perceiving separate person over there either. So my sense of that is, it's not that we're all there together, it's that there isn't an anybody, So, as it were, we're all there together, except there's a continuity. Or the thing that really struck me early on, I kept marveling and thinking, what is going on? How can this be? It seemed like everybody and everything was made out of the same stuff. That's what kept impressing my awareness. How can everything and everybody be made out of the same stuff? But that the fundamental commonality was what I kept noticing, not the separateness or the differentness or the located here versus located over there. And somebody in the practice I used to do, a Swami, once described, this came to me last night when you said that, once described this image of, we're all here on this, you could say, plane, apparently individuals, separate, in relationship, not getting along, talking, all this. And we appear independent of one another. But down below the surface, deep, it's like there's an underground stream that feeds up into each one of us. It's that, there's a thing in one of her poems about no one and absolutely yourself simultaneously. So I love that image that, below the surface, the thing that's feeding all of us or making us into what we are, enabling movement and the physicality and all that, it's all the same. The thing about, and people often make note of this, that as things are opening up for you, as your sense of self is softening, and your attachment and your identity is less tenaciously attached to the outer, what you do, who your friends are, what activities you're engaged in. One of the things that can happen is the reasons for doing things or not doing things begin to come up for you. What you notice, maybe the first thing you notice, is you're not quite so devoted to all the activities, the clubs, stuff people go out and do, parties. Or maybe the friendship that you've had with somebody for a long time isn't quite as compelling as it was. And this could be somebody you're married to or really close to. And it's inevitable that this will happen. All of our lives, until things start to change, we're drawn to the relationships we're drawn to, and we do the things we do in the world, including our work and things we don't get paid to do. We do them so they'll fulfill us. That's why we do what we do. Fulfill us, heal us, distract us from our pain. All that outer stuff starts to shift as we get more real, as we become more whole, as we cease to look outside ourselves for fulfillment, delight, recognition, and here we get to love. What is it to love someone but to want nothing from them? What is it to no longer need the person you love dearly? What's it like for them? Why do we come into the love relationships we come into, whether it's a friend or a lover? We do something for each other. We meet needs, and of course there's also the clashing. But if the clashing is enough less than what we do for each other, it can be stable for a while. But if you stop, as Eckhart says, if there ends up being only one pain body there, instead of the familiar two, there's nobody to play with. And, for the person who's used to you being the way you are, so you're not going to have significant interchange without the outer stuff changing too. And if you try to keep it stable, well, you'll see. It's somewhere between it doesn't work and it's going to cause suffering. The thing to do is to observe what's going on. And don't necessarily expect other people to understand. They might, but you can't, if you're uncomfortable, say you're finding yourself, the friendship you've always had with this person, the basis for the friendship is falling apart for you because you used to get together and gossip all the time. Or you used to get together and commiserate about your problems. And you're no longer so in love with your problems. They don't even feel so much like problems anymore. So the juiciness, you didn't even know until then what was the basis of your friendship. So, while you're focusing on the outer thing and what to do about that, don't neglect what's going on in here. It's like, oh, what does this show you about yourself, what's changed? And forget the idea of trying to change other people. God bless us. When you've seen something, when you've felt your own suffering begin to ease, and then you see somebody you love who's still suffering terribly, your kid, everything in us out of love, and maybe irritation too, because they'd be so much easier to get along with if they just evolve, but mostly it's out of love and kindness and concern. We want so much for them to see what we've seen, for them to blah, blah, blah. Give it up. If there is some possibility of something like that, it comes of you just being the way you are. And, everybody's on their own path, just like you are. The things you see now, you couldn't have seen 6 months ago. It's the same for everybody. So, if you try to keep doing all the same stuff you've been doing before, you're headed into pain. If something is whispering to you, maybe I'm not really all that interested anymore in this thing. Maybe what I'd really like to do is just go sit by myself somewhere that night instead of going to that meeting or that organization or whatever I've been going to. Listen, pay attention. And sometimes you won't be understood. Sometimes you won't be approved of. You can't keep, you can't keep the happy outer thing going and be whole yourself. You just can't. A friend of mine is married to a man she's been with for many years, and she woke up several years ago, and one of the things she confided in me was she realized, even though she finally really loved him in an unconditional way, finally, for the first time, she didn't need him anymore. The need had gone out of it altogether. And this is what the confiding was. She knew he could sense it. And she loved him so much. She had no thought to separate from him at all. They lived well together, and they still do. But she felt for him so much, because after decades of a certain way, something was out of the picture, and he was nervous, and the only thing to do is love. Just let love be there. And it doesn't fix everything. Idea of a spiritual community came up last night, and I think this kind of thing, well, if it's something that you feel you'd love, somebody said he discovered a 1/10 of a mile away from where he'd lived for many years, there was a Course in Miracles group that had been going on for a long time. There's a thing called meetup.com, maybe you know about it, where you can find like-minded, what a concept, but anyway, like something. People, there may be people around you that you don't even know, or you may, could get something going, or maybe it's already going, and it's not necessary. Nothing's necessary. If you feel moved, if you feel like it would be a blessing for you once a week to sit in silence, even if nobody said a word, or once a week or whenever, for people to, sometimes people get together and watch videos, or just share very deeply, in a very vulnerable way. In fact, there's a group around here, nobody here in it, but yes, thank you, who've been meeting for 3 years, I think. Yeah. So I think it's the kind of thing where if you want it to happen, if it feels like something you would appreciate, chances are you can bring it about or find one that is happening. And if it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen, and there's so much going on in our, we are a lot of company to ourselves. Someone said about illness or physical pain, if I have let's say, chronic or what's the kind that means you're dying? Terminal illness, which is to say, illness that is going to go on for some period of time, near as we can tell, or chronic pain. I heard somebody tell a story recently I really loved. This was just, God, so illustrative of what our minds do. So this is somebody who has cancer. And she's known for a little while that she's got it, and she's, kind of into the treatment and all that stuff. She was driving to hospital one day to have chemo treatment, and she suddenly realized, I never actually directly experienced that I have cancer. Do you see how astounding that is? What does she experience? She experiences right now that she's in her car doing this. And in a few minutes she'll experience that she's sitting in the chair and the nurse is putting the needle in her arm. Now she knows, if she goes into her mind, that she has cancer. She's been given a presumably reliable diagnosis, etc. But do you see, what she saw there was the difference between what you can do in your mind and what you actually directly experience. At some point she may be experiencing pain if the treatment doesn't work or if the treatment itself is painful. And then what she'll be experiencing is a moment of pain. But she never has and she never could, nor can anyone directly experience that you have cancer or that you have anything. Do you see? when you see the difference between, like, what do you have to go into your mind to actually know, the difference between that and any momentary experience. Do you see this? If you couldn't think, you just move from sensation, location, sensation, location, sensation. That's all we ever actually do. Now, we do need to think. Yes, if you have cancer, it's good to know you have it. It's good to go get treatment for it. It's to see the difference between what you have access to when you think and what you have access to in a moment of actual experience. That's where awakening is. When you see again and again, as many times as you have to, what is the difference between right now, any direct experience, and anything I have to go into my mind to think about? It has nothing to do with whether this is true, notice. It's the difference between experience and thought. So if I have chronic physical pain or some limitation, or even if I just broke my leg and it's going to be 2 hours before the ambulance can get me to the hospital and the shot in me, or whatever. All you're ever experiencing is this pain right now. And the mind comes and says, oh my God, how long is this going to last? Or I'm going to have this the rest of my life. If you've been told that, it's a death sentence basically, or there's nothing they can do to get rid of it. When you think about it, then your mind is creating the image of day after day, or minute after minute, hour after hour. And when you try to be with that or try to imagine, it's hideous, but you're not physically experiencing that. You're experiencing only this right now. All we're ever asked to do is to surrender to this right now, whether it's physical pain or limitation or this woman who, some of you have maybe heard this, but most of you haven't. And even if you've heard it, it bears hearing 100 times. Somebody I know whose husband announced to her that he wanted a divorce quite out of the blue. She had no idea this was coming. As far as she knew, things were good. He wanted a divorce, and a week or something later, she found out she had cancer. And she's a very upbeat, positive person, and creative and busy and well-loved and all that. And her life is rich, and usually she's having a great time. But, with this like 1-2 punch, she was crying a fair amount of the time. She'd remember, oh my God. Because once in a while you forget, but then you remember, She'd wake up in the morning, and for the first 90 seconds, she wouldn't remember that her husband was leaving her and that she had cancer. So she had, was having very emotional episodes, naturally, as anybody would, as it was sinking into her. And then one day she was in her bedroom sobbing, and sank down to the floor, just, collapsed in grief of it all. And because she was on the floor, she could see underneath the bed. And she saw a shoe underneath the bed that had been missing for a really long time. And all of a sudden, she went, oh my God, there's that shoe. You're laughing in recognition, right? Now, she noticed this. This is the blessing of such a moment, and of this woman. She noticed, wow, when I forgot that my husband is leaving me and I have cancer, all the emotion just drained out of me. Now, was it still true that her husband was leaving her? Yes. It's not about whether it's true. Of course she still had cancer. But right then, it was just a shoe under the bed. She was having no direct experience of cancer. And, her husband was still, do you see? So what this illustrated to her is, what I hope it would illustrate to you, and from your own experience of this same kind of thing. We imagine that if something is true, and it's out there in the ether being true somewhere, either we need to be thinking about it all the time just because it's true, or, and here's the really powerful thing, that it continues to be true even when we're not thinking about it. Wow. Wow. Do we have a choice about what we think about? Oh my goodness, yes. And if you don't think you do, you don't. But when you discover you do, then you do. And the ego will say, oh no, but it's an ongoing situation. Of course it's got to torture me every hour of the day. But what if you could keep seeing shoes under the bed? What about that? That's not about denial. Cheryl brought up this thing last night. Why do we run away from joy? And reminded me of, I was with some people at a writing workshop a while ago, and somehow before we started the official workshop, people just arriving. Somehow the subject came up of what it would be like to really be able to let down your guard, drop the vigilance completely. The idea that what if it were possible to, as it were, lie down in a place where you could completely, absolutely rest, the bottom line, completely let all the tension and anxiety and vigilance out of your body, and know that nothing would ever harm you ever again, and you wouldn't ever have to exert any effort. And it got quiet for a minute, and somebody said, it puts me into a panic. So when you said that last night, Cheryl, I thought of that, and I said, why? Why would that put you into a panic? Well, because what if it didn't hold? How do you know? Like, we want to know that if I run off the cliff, or if I completely let myself die, which is not what's really happening, but we think is what's happening. We want some assurance. Or the other thing is, I think it's like we can't believe that we don't need to earn it. We can't believe it's innate. It's one of those too good to be true things. So I think we protect, it's like, why do we protect ourselves from anything? Why are people afraid to really open their hearts and love? It's like, well, what if you're opening yourself to hurt? What if when you open yourself to exquisite joy, you're also opening yourself to exquisite pain, which you are. But I think the really juicy thing about this idea is, or fruitful thing is, if you notice that there's a too good to be true thing going on, or you're afraid of the sweetness of it, you're afraid of, you can't even stand to taste it, because then what if the old way reasserts itself, which, it will 100 times before it doesn't, maybe. If that's happening, if you realize you're holding back, pay attention to the holding backness. Don't judge it, don't try to, psychoanalyze it. Just notice the fear or the tension or the whatever, and feel it in your body. And you might just notice yourself going soft. We don't know. So Helen, do you remember what you wanted to say before?
You actually answered it in the course of the
Oh. Anybody, is there anything you're wanting?
This quote from St. Francis, I don't know which St. Francis, that said, love hurts as a bird sings.
Say it again. Louder.
Love hurts as a bird sings. But it's not like a rock and roll song. Love hurts. No,
Yeah.
it's just an emotional.
Yeah. An open heart is an open heart. And, just say, as you're open to yourself, you know, it's not like picking and choosing. You get to open your heart to the parts of yourself that you like and are comfortable with. So when you open your heart to the world or to other people, you're not, it's not discriminatory. You don't discriminate. Yeah.
So, going back to what you were talking about with the story about the cancer, and you were saying how our minds, you know, it's not real. The cancer, she never experienced the cancer. What she did experience was, you know, being in the car and whatnot. And so it came up the question of, with language, we use constraints. That's what language is. We put labels on. So she was putting a label on what the diagnosis showed. So can you say something about that, as on how the mind and the experience, because with that label provided for her, gave the mind choices. She could go through a regimen of chemotherapy, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Or not.
That's the good of it. And so there is a usefulness to all of that, but it's not, it's different from anything that she can directly experience. So this isn't an argument for foregoing labels and intellectual understanding or diagnosis or for making plans, or it's seeing what its usefulness is, entering into it where there's actual usefulness, and then declining to enter into it when it causes only suffering. Mind causes suffering. And that's why the fact that we have these wonderful brains is truly a blessing. Because we never would have come up with treatments. We wouldn't have figured out how to diagnose. We wouldn't figure out what causes cancer if we didn't have that. It's just that we take the ego takes the diagnosis, the name, as a way to generate fear. You know, is it possible to find out that one has cancer and to look at the treatments and to undergo the treatments and all that and not be afraid constantly? Yes, it is. Amazing.
Sometimes they turn out to be wrong.
Well, there is that, yeah. Yeah. And when we label something ourselves, you know, if I say, I mean, this is what we do. Because we have the language capacity, and the language so often is along a scale of good to bad. Because we can do it, we automatically do it. So everything we process with our worded, highly intelligent minds that are able to perceive category and sameness and differentness and all that, the ego thinks that we can't do any of that without automatically knowing whether I like something or don't like it, or pronouncing it good or bad, or, you know, it's like, what is it like to experience your exact same life without that happening? And here you're out in the field beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing. What is it like? What's bad weather? This is like bad weather. I mean, will you think about that for a minute? And how automatically we say, we think, we feel. So, you know, it's not like stop yourself from using the words bad weather. That's silly and stupid and useless. It's like, look in there and see what is that actually, what's really going on there. And weather, you know, talk about things you have no control over. Why get pissy about something? I mean, what more obvious thing could there be to absolutely not have along a scale of good or bad than the weather? Anyway, what else? Say other things, yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how this relates, but when I was a teenager, I moved to another country where I didn't speak the language. And I found that when I was with people, I just really liked them. And one day this friend said to me, well, that's because you have no idea about that experience that always
Yes.
stuck with me is like, you could just sit there and listen to people all day long, because it wasn't the mind that was listening, you know, I was like, I couldn't understand. And yet I never felt so, I don't know, much sort of at ease. And I mean, today I'm a language teacher, so it's all very ironic, but
Isn't that something?
I always think of that in that context of
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Eckhart talks about how, you know, he himself grew up in more than one culture, had more than one language because of that, and, you know, just the thing about going someplace where you're not used to being. The whole sense of self, like you don't even know. There are things about yourself you don't know until you go to some other place, and then you realize, oh, not everybody is like this. And then you become, you know, maybe aware. It just all gets very much softer, and it's interesting. What else? Other things coming up?
Yeah, just to follow on that, when my boys were, I sat with them when I was reading them a story, and I said, I'm reading you this story, and you see these pictures, and when you look at this page over here, what do you see? Do you see anything other than sort of black marks on the paper? And they said, no, it's just black on the paper. And then a couple of years later, same experience, and all they saw was words. And one of them told me, I remember driving down Main Street, and all of a sudden, every piece of the word, everything had words on it, and everything had a name. And I couldn't, and I remember him sitting in the back seat saying, you know, jewelry, and the idea of being so captivated by that ability. And then the thing that followed when I was following that thought was when he texted somebody about something that somebody else had said about doing something violent to somebody he didn't like in school. All of a sudden, the words were so powerful and so dangerous. And there was a phone call from the principal and a conversation in the office, and he started to realize it's a tool, but it has edges. Very powerful.
Yeah. And you can't go back. Once you recognize those things as a word, you can't not see the word and what it represents.
One more step. He loves, I think it's called manga, Japanese videos. He has a whole series of Japanese videos he watches, and they're all subtitled. But the street scenes of these cartoons, all the signs are in Japanese. So I'm watching, and there's this little clue about what's going on. People are saying, like, the whole world is full of things that don't mean anything except their building. So it was like being a little kid. What is that?
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. I'm thinking of what happens when you find out Santa Claus is, you know, made up. Yeah, I know. Sorry, I hate to be the one to tell you. But really, if you look at what goes on when you come to see, and it's easy for us, if those of us who grew up believing in Santa Claus, it's easy to get how the utter turning point, the utter impossibility of going back, when you realize Santa Claus is made up. You cannot go back. You can't unknow what you know. Well, and just like with the word, you can't not see it once you can read it. You can't fail to know what it means. When you really get, and this is why, back on those things, the thing about when you wake up and you really get that you're not your ego, you can't go back. You can't enter again into that believing in Santa Claus. It's just like that.
You can still play the game, but it's not so serious.
It's a game, then. Yeah.
So then why I've heard that people have awakened experiences and then go back?
And all I can say is, it's just an experience, and there's something, when they're in it, as we say, they can't imagine that they're ever going to go back. But the fact that nobody can know. Like, I don't have any idea what tomorrow's going to be like for me. Right? It's only looking back you can see. If you did slip back into the other, you can say then, it hadn't, the identification hadn't completely stopped. It just hadn't. We couldn't be pulled back. So, so then you can see looking backwards, well, I was having an experience. And lots of people have lots of experiences. And, Adyashani talks about an image for it is a rocket ship trying to get out of the atmosphere. It takes enormous energy to break get out of gravity or whatever's going on.
Gravitational pull.
Thank you. But once you're out there, it's just like no power at all required. And there's no way you're going back unless you power up the engines again. And so you could say if somebody has multiple episodes of, seeming like they're awake, but it turns out it was temporary, the gravitational pull toward the ego hadn't been really escaped. But that's something you can probably know only in retrospect. So if you have, and many of you have, had times of seconds or days where, it's like I told you last night with that woman whose email I read. Somebody will say, I think it's all over. and I want to, I wish I could say to them in some way, don't think about it. Don't think about it. I don't want to say, don't get your hopes up. It's not my business to do that. But I'm saying to you now, notice that if you have, you wake up one morning and you realize your mind's been quiet all day, or whatever makes itself apparent to you. The mind, because it's curious, and the ego is like this always, will come in around the edges and say, wow, looky this. Gee, I wonder if this is going to last, and then it stops. That's what people say. As soon as the ego does that, tries to understand what's going on, or tries to make it into an achievement, blah, 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 blah. The useful thing to do is, if you notice that kind of thing occurring, just don't indulge it, don't try to answer it. Don't try to come up with the answer to the question, because then you're cooked. Just see, oh yeah, there's a thought, then it goes away. You don't know. You don't know. We're not in charge. And there isn't a magic day, when you could say, okay, it's been, 17 days, it's 10:25, must be here for good. Just be glad. Just, here's where gratitude comes in handy. Whatever you have right now is all you got, whether you're feeling awake or completely unconscious. And other things you want to?
What did you say that the ego has had an experience and it's temporary? The ego is...
Well, the ego will come in and say, is this going to last? I don't know specifically what you mean, but the ego will notice it as a phenomenon and start to feel like, oh boy, maybe this is really it. Or, gee, I wonder if this is going to last. And the mind is assisting it in that effort. And the next thing you know, you're back in ego completely.
I had an experience for once, and I thought it was permanent. I felt like it was permanent. Oh, God was living in the chest. And all relationships there were no problems. Problems were just not there. There's nothing to think about. And if a situation, if something came up, it was just handled. I didn't have to do anything. I was just sitting back watching. And then one day, the mind came in and said, what are you going to do with this? Are you going to take this and teach? Are you going to go find out if other people have this? Are you going to stay here in this, like Eckhart sat on the park bench for 2 years? I thought that was a good idea because this is just permanent. This is pretty blissful. Or are you going to come back in the world? And it seemed like a choice. And the choice was to come back in this world. Even though there's a remnant of that, coming back into the world feels like it's the wrong choice. So I don't know what happened, but it felt like a choice. It didn't feel like a trick or mind or ego thing.
Who knows what really happened? But there is such a thing as coming back into the world. Wait, I can't remember how you said it, but the incarnation. There is such a thing as come back into the world, but not be caught up in it. It's like in the world, but not of it. But the ego might confuse that with being attached. Coming back into the world means, like, there's something that says it's impossible to be in the world without all the attachment and identity and all that, and unconsciousness coming with it. So it could be that there was an intuition there of the possibility of being in the world without all that. But the default was strong enough that the old way asserted itself because of an assumption that there wasn't any other possibility. Who knows? And some people, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. And it's like a thing I never imagined would be an outcome of my writing a book about my own thing, was that people would get in touch with me and say what had happened with them. Sometimes when people report that this kind of thing has occurred for a period of time and then it went away, they're bitter, or they've become rabid seekers. They're just absolutely determined to get it back no matter what. And some of them want to die because it's not happening. And then some people who've had like a 3-second, like my 90-year-old friend who died recently, had a few seconds long experience when she was 18 that she never forgot. And many of you have had those kinds of things, brief or whatever. The overwhelming thing is gratitude. It's like, oh my God. It's like, oh. Somebody, where did I read this recently? Somebody said the sweetest thing. I can't remember. If it only happened for a few seconds, okay, it's enough. Don't be greedy. It's like, and am I going to say that the people who are that way as opposed to bitter and suffering are more likely to eventually, I have no idea. You are the way you are. You are the way you are. I just have observed, differences about it. And I'm just saying, Eckhart talks about there's momentum, and it's like the flywheel in a car. Certain stuff keeps going for a while, even though you may think, oh, I thought I was done with suffering, but how come this is still happening? And, there is that. We have, habits that are decades long and patterns and all that. it's not up to us to understand every single thing that's going on about the process. And the main thing is, if you notice yourself that you're starting to think about it, wondering, trying to draw conclusions, understand, blah, 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 rather than indulging that process, which is just feeding the mind, it's like throwing another piece of wood into the wood stove, okay? Rather than doing any of that, observe that the thinking is there, trying to understand, and just rest. Just rest. The thing of what do I do? What do I do with this? I had, that kind of thing went on for me early on. I couldn't believe it. It's like I would, go out in public and I'd see everybody suffering, and I just wanted to go up to total strangers and say, it doesn't have to be this way. Really? No. I mean, they would have locked me up if I had done what I really wanted to do. And lucky me, I happened upon a woman who had been awake for a long time through, apparently, A Course in Miracles. And she was like my mother. I didn't even meet her in person for a long time. But I was on the phone with her once, or emailing or something, and I said, I'm just bursting. I want to know what I can do to be of help. Blah, blah, blah. And she emailed me and said, she had gotten me to get a copy of A Course in Miracles, which I'd always been curious about, but I'd never read. And she said, read so-and-so. So I went and opened the book, and it said, you need do nothing. Right? Which, Lori, you need do nothing. Which the woman in the email said she finally got that. Oh, nothing means nothing. It's like, oh, really? Krishnamurti talked about the ground of being. He was in a dialogue once with this physicist, David Bohm, and somebody said something about how do you, I don't know what, like how do you use this that you have? And he said, the ground of being is, I don't know what his words were, but it was something like, wherever I go, there it is. I'm not in charge of what it does. There isn't anywhere it's not. And, it's profoundly humbling. We're going to should we take a break now? Okay, let's take a break now.